Houston reflected Ted Cruz's methodical nature, legal memos neatly stacked on his home office desk, his courtroom notes already reviewed the night before. He wasn't heading to Capitol Hill, where he typically sparred with senators and defended constitutional principles. Today was more personal, a civil hearing at the Houston Municipal Court over a contract dispute involving his family's investment property, one he believed had been wrongly interpreted. Ted opted for a more relaxed outfit than his usual Senate attire. A crisp navy blazer, a white button-down shirt, and charcoal gray slacks. Standing in front of his bathroom mirror, he combed through his thick, dark hair, now flecked with gray, a reminder of the political wars he'd fought. At 53, his face carried the sharp determination honed from arguing before the Supreme Court and grilling cabinet nominees. "Just a quick court stop," he muttered, grabbing a protein bar and a travel mug filled with strong black coffee. His black Tesla Model S, which he'd once dubbed the conservative bullet, was waiting silently in the garage. It was a gift to himself after surviving another brutal election cycle. Occasionally, he caught people doing a double take, seeing a conservative firebrand step out of an eco-friendly car. Made for good headlines and snarky tweets. Houston traffic crawled. Cruz wasn't worried. He'd left with a time cushion. He tuned into a local AM talk radio station, half listening to the latest DC chatter, while mentally reviewing documents related to the dispute. The issue stemmed from a maintenance contract with a local contractor, one that included a payment schedule conflicting with the finalized invoice. Cruz had printed and photographed everything. He came prepared. Then his car's Bluetooth lit up. Incoming call, Michael Reynolds, Senate leadership staff. Ted's pulse quickened. A direct call from Reynolds this early usually meant trouble. "Senator Cruz, sorry to bother you this morning," came Michael's voice. "We've got an issue with the President's Gulf of America statement. The press is spinning it like wildfire. We need your input on a response ASAP." Cruz's jaw tightened. The decree, rebranding the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America, was one of the administration's most mocked moves, and Cruz had been its strongest Senate defender. Now the media was tearing into it again, and time was ticking. "How fast do you need it?" Cruz asked, eyes flicking to the road. "Before noon. I'm emailing you a full packet now. Can you take a look and get back to me?" "Give me 20 minutes. He veered off toward a quiet parking lot near a local coffee shop, opened his laptop, tethered to his phone, and pulled up the documents. The media's questions were sharp, even brutal. This response would have to be airtight, legally and rhetorically. Cruz got to work, tapping notes with the same precision he once used preparing Supreme Court arguments. He lost track of time. A glance at his watch snapped him back. He was 10 minutes from the courthouse, and the hearing was starting soon. He rang Michael, offered a quick outline of his stance, and promised a finalized response later that afternoon. Back in traffic, Ted Cruz gripped the wheel, muttering a prayer under his breath. He was rarely late. Discipline and punctuality were his political trademarks. But he also understood his role as a national figure came with obligations. If this Gulf of America issue spun out of control, it could hurt the president and energize the opposition. When he finally pulled into the courthouse parking lot, 7 minutes behind schedule, his phone buzzed with a message from Michael. "Your notes nailed it. Thanks for jumping in, Senator." Cruz cracked a small smile. At least being late had served a purpose. But what Senator Ted Cruz didn't yet realize, rushing up the courthouse steps, files tucked under his arm, was that being a few minutes late was about to ignite something far larger than a civil hearing. He was walking straight into a political and judicial powder keg. Inside the courtroom sat Judge Elizabeth Warren, presiding for the week over a slate of minor municipal cases, contract disputes, traffic violations, procedural hearings. Though the docket was routine, Warren brought with her a reputation for sharp discipline and ideological resolve. At 70, her silver hair neatly combed, glasses perched with purpose, and black robe immaculate, she exuded both intellectual rigor and moral certainty, qualities that had shaped her years in the Senate and beyond. As she surveyed the courtroom, already filled with over 24 attendees, her gaze swept across the benches. Most had arrived early, paperwork in hand, attire neat. Warren gave an approving nod. "Order matters." All rise, called the bailiff, Robert Hayes, his voice calm but commanding. The session began like clockwork. Judge Warren moved through the early cases with swift precision, every word deliberate. To her, punctuality wasn't just a formality, it was a measure of respect for the institution. Then, the double doors creaked open. Ted Cruz entered quietly, moving with confidence but caution. He tried not to disrupt the flow of the hearing and progress, but Judge Warren noticed immediately. She stopped mid-sentence, her expression hardening. Her sharp eyes locked on him. "Senator Cruz," she said, her voice cold as steel, "step forward." The courtroom went silent. Warren set aside the current case without a second thought. Cruz approached the bench, posture straight, chin lifted, not in arrogance, but in practiced composure. He'd testified before Senate committees, argued in federal courts, and faced media ambushes. But the tension in this room felt different. "You were scheduled at the start of this session," Warren continued, her tone biting. "Do you believe your time is more valuable than the court's?" Before he could answer, she pressed on. "We operate under rules in this courtroom," she said, now loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is not a Senate floor. It is not a press conference. You don't stroll in on your own timeline." A few people in the back shifted uncomfortably. Just minutes earlier, a local businessman had arrived late and received nothing more than a brief glance. Cruz kept his hands folded before him, observing her carefully. He noticed what many others hadn't dared say aloud yet. She hadn't once looked at his paperwork. Her reaction wasn't rooted in procedure. It was personal. Her every word dripped with the unspoken tension between two ideological titans, one conservative, the other progressive, brought face to face outside of Congress. From the side of the room, Robert Hayes, the bailiff, furrowed his brow. In 15 years, he'd seen this courtroom apply rules unevenly, especially when personalities clashed with the judge's ideals. "Your Honor," Cruz began, voice measured and respectful. "You may not speak," Warren snapped, cutting him off without a glance. "I've heard every excuse from traffic to national security. Tardiness is tardiness, and no title puts anyone above the law." Ted Cruz didn't flinch. He simply listened. He'd seen these tactics before. Discredit the opponent before they speak. Control the room before reason enters. But this time it wouldn't go unanswered. "May I explain?" Cruz began, his voice calm, composed, and unmistakably senatorial. "You may not," Judge Warren snapped, her tone as sharp as a blade. Her interruption wasn't procedural, it was intentional. Her tone radiated authority, but also something colder. A warning, the kind that didn't allow rebuttal. She waved her hand as if brushing away his presence. "I've heard every excuse in the book, Senator. Traffic, emergencies, late-night calls from the Hill. None of that matters here," she declared, lifting her gavel slightly. Even its stillness seemed to assert dominance. This session was set to begin on time. In the gallery, spectators sat frozen. Some shifted uncomfortably. A sharply dressed young woman who had arrived moments before Cruz remained unbothered. Her late arrival had gone unnoticed. The inconsistency was glaring. Warren, however, was unmoved. "This court will not tolerate disregard for order," she said, her face beginning to flush as Cruz maintained his composure. "Perhaps a fine will serve as a reminder of the importance of punctuality," she added, her voice laced with a performative edge. Cruz remained motionless at the podium, his gaze unwavering. He'd endured grilling on national television, courtroom battles before the Supreme Court, and hostile interviews with combative reporters. But this was different. This wasn't scrutiny. This was contempt in a robe. The courtroom's tension grew thick. The other defendants watched with growing unease. Even Mrs. Margaret Evans, the middle-aged court clerk who had worked with Warren for years, felt a ripple of discomfort. Her fingers hovered hesitantly over the keyboard. She'd seen Judge Warren deliver harsh words before, but not like this. Not with this much venom, not with this much purpose. She remembered clearly, just a week prior, a gray-haired defense attorney had strolled in 20 minutes late. No fine, no lecture, just a nod and a mild, amused comment from the bench. Now the gavel came down hard. "Senator Cruz," Judge Warren intoned, leaning forward in her high-backed chair. This court hereby fines you $500 for contempt. Gasps rippled across the benches. It was one of the steepest penalties ever issued for mere tardiness. But Warren didn't flinch. She let the number hang in the air. Cruz said nothing. His mind, always precise, recorded every detail. Her refusal to hear an explanation, the contrast with previous defendants, the subtle satisfaction in her voice. It wasn't just discipline, it was bias, dressed as protocol. He'd seen it before. Not just from political opponents, but from bureaucrats who masked their prejudice in the language of process. Mrs. Evans reluctantly typed the fine into the system. But she also reached under her desk, quietly opening a small logbook she'd kept for years. And with slightly trembling fingers, she made a new entry. Senator fined, no prior warning. Others late, no penalty. Judge Warren wasn't done. Let this serve as a lesson, she said, theatrically lifting a printed document, pretending to read from it. This court runs on order, not ego. Without punctuality, we descend into chaos. From the benches, reactions varied. That same young woman glanced at her watch, suddenly recalling her own unnoticed tardiness. An elderly man in the back shook his head gently. He had witnessed this kind of selective enforcement before. Robert Hayes, the bailiff, stood still but clenched his jaw slightly. In 15 years, he'd seen this script unfold before. Warren didn't always treat everyone the same, but no one ever called it out. Cruz inhaled slowly, deeply. This wasn't just a fine, it was a carefully staged public shaming. One meant to cut more than reputation. It was meant to humiliate. But what Judge Warren didn't realize yet was that her sharp rebuke had just given Cruz something far more valuable than vindication: leverage. And he wasn't done. This wasn't just personal anymore. Yes, it was a targeted rebuke, but it now represented something larger. A system failing quietly under the weight of its own biases. Ted Cruz silently pulled out his phone, typing a brief note and logging the $500 contempt fine, the exact phrasing used, and the visible inconsistency of treatment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt. He documented. Judge Warren leaned in slightly, her tone growing more authoritarian. "You'll pay that fine before you leave today," she said, her voice cutting. "We wouldn't want you being late for that too, would we?" A few nervous chuckles stirred in the gallery, quickly silenced by the growing tension. Sunlight filtered through the windows, now casting a glow directly onto Cruz as he stood alone at the podium. Though his face was still, his eyes had shifted, from courteous to calculating. It was the look of a man who had spent decades sharpening his legal mind, preparing for a moment exactly like this. Judge Warren couldn't see it yet, but she had just handed him the very ammunition he needed. "Do you understand the fine as I've explained it, Senator?" Warren asked, her tone dripping with control. Cruz raised his head slightly. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and level. "I understand completely." To the casual ear, it sounded like submission, but those who knew Cruz, and Warren should have, understood otherwise. Behind those words was a mind already organizing arguments, evidence, witnesses. He had played this game before. Warren, satisfied, turned toward the next file on her desk, assuming it was over. It wasn't, not even close. Cruz reached down, opened his briefcase, and slowly removed a leather-bound notebook, a compilation of legal insights and constitutional precedents he'd gathered throughout his career. The weight of that book wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. "Your Honor," his voice rang out now, no longer soft-spoken but resonant and firm. "Before this court proceeds, I must place something on the record." The room froze. Even the ceiling fan's gentle hum seemed suddenly louder. Cruz held the notebook up for the court to see. "I am Senator Ted Cruz, a constitutional attorney and former Supreme Court clerk. I am not here as counsel, but I do have the legal background to contest this court's ruling on both procedural fairness and equal treatment under the law." Judge Warren's face paled. The authority she had worn like a crown now flickered. Her hand froze mid-turn over the next case file. She looked up, and for the first time that morning, truly saw him. Not just the man who arrived late, but the mind standing before her. "I apologize for being late, Your Honor," Cruz continued, measured but resolute. I was delayed by an urgent matter involving Senate leadership in the administration's response to the Gulf of America decree, which I believe you've seen in the press." He paused. "I have the email confirmation from Chief Legislative Advisor Michael Reynolds, if the court would like to verify it." A young woman in the gallery, the same one whose own tardiness had gone unnoticed, suddenly sat straighter, realizing she was watching something transformative. An older man in the back, one who had known injustice when he saw it, nodded silently. Judge Warren's mouth opened, then closed. She fumbled with the papers in front of her. "If I'd known your role," she began. "My role shouldn't matter, Your Honor," Cruz said, his voice sharp but still respectful. "What matters is fairness, consistency, and the integrity of this courtroom." He placed the notebook on the podium and tapped his phone. "I've documented multiple examples from this morning. 7 individuals entered this courtroom after session began. 3 were middle-aged professionals, none reprimanded. 2 were young students, verbally warned, and 2, including myself, were fined or publicly chastised." Judge Warren's complexion shifted from flushed red to pale green. "These are very serious accusations," she said, her voice faltering for the first time. "I assure you, Senator, this court treats all equally." "The evidence suggests otherwise," Cruz replied calmly. Then he turned not just to the judge, but to the entire courtroom. "I've already forwarded a formal summary of these proceedings to my Senate staff. As a public official, I have a duty to speak out when bias and selective enforcement creep into our institutions." The courtroom buzzed with energy. Phones were pulled out. Mrs. Margaret Evans, the clerk, resumed typing, this time with renewed purpose. She'd seen too much over the years. This time someone was speaking for all of them. "What exactly are you proposing?" Warren asked, the tension in her voice now barely concealed. Cruz placed both hands on the podium. "3 actions," he said plainly. "First, I will pay the $500 fine. Not because it is just, but because it will serve as documented evidence of today's events." He raised 2 fingers. "Second, I formally request an independent review of the last 6 months of contempt rulings issued from this bench, examining patterns in how and to whom they were applied." He paused. Then the final blow. "Third, I propose mandatory bias awareness training for all courtroom personnel, including the bench itself." The room fell silent, then electric. Evans's fingers flew across the keys, determined to record every syllable. Bailiff Hayes gave the faintest of nods. He'd seen injustice go unchecked for years. Today, that pattern cracked. Warren tried to regain footing. "Senator, while your concerns may be well-intentioned, don't you think these demands are a bit extreme for a simple case of tardiness?" Cruz didn't flinch. "With all due respect, what's extreme is how normalized these inconsistencies have become. In the Senate, I've seen how minor injustices pile up quietly until they become walls to justice itself." He reached into his case again and pulled out a personal check. "I'll pay the fine, but I won't be quiet about what it represents." "I'll pay the fine now," Cruz said, sliding the check across the podium, his voice calm, unshaken. There was no anger, no theatrics, just the resolute tone of a man who understood exactly how to challenge injustice from within. The morning sun now streamed across the courtroom floor, flooding every corner in sharp light. Judge Warren remained seated in her elevated chair, but something had changed. She no longer looked unshakable. The gavel sat idle. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone felt it. What had begun as a routine civil appearance had become something entirely different, a constitutional turning point in miniature. By late afternoon, the story exploded across New Hampshire's political and legal circles. It began quietly. A young law student who had witnessed the scene live texted her study group. "Just saw Ted Cruz take down a judge in open court. Not a soundbite. Legal brilliance. You won't believe this." That single message launched a ripple across campus forums, legal blogs, and eventually mainstream media. In his Senate office, Cruz was reviewing responses to the Gulf of America decree when his phone began buzzing nonstop. First came calls from colleagues in Texas and fellow senators, then messages from former law clerks, attorneys, even judges. Many had faced Elizabeth Warren's rigid judicial style before, but had kept silent, fearing political fallout. "This isn't just about me," Cruz told his longtime advisor, David Parker, who had come by to check on him. "If this happens to a U.S. senator with legal credentials, imagine what happens to everyday Americans, people without a platform." He scrolled through the dozens of messages pouring in, stories of fines, reprimands, intimidation, names, cases, patterns. Meanwhile, in the courthouse break room, Mrs. Margaret Evans, the court clerk, sat with her coffee, staring at her desk drawer. After a long pause, she pulled out a small notebook. "I've been keeping records for years," she whispered to a colleague. "Dates, names, fins, everything that felt off." Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, the weight of long-held silence now beginning to lift. By early evening, local TV cameras lined up outside the courthouse. Jonathan Lee, lead reporter for Channel 7 News, stood ready. Sources confirmed that Senator Ted Cruz was fined $500 this morning for arriving late to court. But what happened next is sparking a statewide debate about bias and selective justice. Within hours, hashtags like #WarrenGate and #LegalGenius began trending on social media. Former defendants shared eerily similar experiences, particularly younger or lesser-known individuals who had faced disproportionately harsh treatment from Warren's bench. Back at her home, Judge Elizabeth Warren sat watching the news, her phone lighting up again and again. Calls from fellow judges, the state judicial board, even former Senate colleagues. In 30 years of public service, she had weathered storms. But this was different. This was data, testimony, and optics, all turning against her. Cruz's office phone rang again, this time from Emily Carter, a respected New Hampshire political journalist. "We've been investigating courtroom bias for years," Emily said. "But hearing this story from you changes everything. You gave it a name, a face, a legal roadmap." She paused. "Would you speak at a press conference tomorrow outside the courthouse?" Inside the courthouse filing office, staff had already begun pulling Judge Warren's past rulings. One clerk stopped mid-scan. "Over the past year," she whispered to her colleague, "defendants under 35 received the maximum fine 3 times more often than older ones for the same offenses." Another found dozens of verbal reprimands aimed at young professionals, students, or politically affiliated litigants. By nightfall, national headlines had taken hold. U.S. Senator sparks judicial reckoning in local courtroom. Ted Cruz exposes systemic bias in shocking legal showdown. Social media ignites over Warren's courtroom conduct. Robert Hayes, the courtroom bailiff, fielded several calls from colleagues that evening. "We've all seen it," he told one of them, "year after year, but this time someone saw it and refused to look away." He sat back in his kitchen chair and reflected on what he had watched unfold. This wasn't about party or politics anymore. This was about what happens when a single voice, backed by clarity and principle, holds the system accountable. Robert Hayes had watched scenes like that unfold for years, unable to act, bound by duty, constrained by hierarchy. But this time something was different. Late that night, Senator Ted Cruz sat in his Senate office, scrolling through hundreds of messages flooding in from across the country. Political advocacy groups invited him to keynote their summits on judicial ethics. Legal nonprofits asked if he would help document patterns of courtroom bias. Law schools requested he guest lecture on the growing role of elected officials in preserving constitutional integrity. The incident with Judge Warren had grown beyond a single courtroom or a single fine. It had become a catalyst. Opening his laptop, Cruz began drafting a formal referral to the Senate Judiciary Committee and a supporting report to the New Hampshire Judicial Conduct Board. This wasn't just about a single moment of misconduct. It was about a system that had allowed it to fester. As he typed, his phone buzzed again, a message from a young law student. "Thank you for showing us that the system can be challenged from within. You gave us hope." A week later, the New Hampshire Judicial Conduct Committee officially launched an independent investigation into Judge Elizabeth Warren's courtroom history. The 10th floor of the state's Justice Building was alive with activity. Conference rooms overflowed with case files and laptops. The investigative team, led by Laura Bennett, a seasoned legal analyst with over 2 decades of experience, dove into thousands of records. She projected a spreadsheet on the wall and turned to her staff. "Look at these numbers," she said, pointing to column after column. In minor contract disputes, defendants under 30 received an average fine of $400. Defendants over 50, just $120 for the same offenses. She adjusted her glasses and sighed. And that's just the start. A few doors down in a small interview room, Mrs. Margaret Evans sat with her leather-bound notebook open in front of her. For 12 years, she had typed away at the corner of Judge Warren's bench, watching, listening, recording. Now, at last, she was speaking. "I noticed the pattern almost immediately," she told the committee, her voice wavering slightly. How she addressed people changed depending on their age, or if they were politically known. Her tone, the time she gave them to speak, the interruptions, it wasn't consistent. Her hands trembled as she flipped to a marked page. This was from 2 years ago. A college student fined $750 for being late. No prior record, no questions asked. The investigation expanded quickly beyond fines and courtroom temperament. Investigators conducted in-depth interviews with former defendants, public defenders, court staff, local journalists. Bailiff Robert Hayes submitted a handwritten statement summarizing hundreds of incidents from his 15-year tenure. "Some days I'd count how many times she interrupted young defendants versus older ones," he wrote. "The younger ones were interrupted 5 times more often. It wasn't just noticeable, it was impossible to ignore." Back in D.C., Senator Cruz's office transformed into a war room of sorts. His legislative assistant wheeled in binders filled with submitted testimonials. Young congressional staffers, local activists, and constituents shared stories. Fines, reprimands, silencing, double standards. Cruz, standing over a table piled with papers, turned to his aide. "We need to organize all of this. Every story, every record, every ruling. This isn't about one judge. This is about how deeply rooted these biases have become." The groundwork had been laid. The numbers were clear. The patterns undeniable. Judge Warren's reputation as both an enforcer of order and a moral authority now faced its greatest test. And Ted Cruz, whether by fate or fire, had become the unexpected tip of the spear in a larger reckoning. "It's not just about this one case," Senator Ted Cruz said during a closed-door Senate briefing. "It's about reshaping how we define justice and how we hold power accountable when it strays into arrogance." The investigation team had uncovered something far deeper than individual misconduct. The data was clear. Young women received the highest fines on average. Defendants under 30 had their cases processed 40% faster, often with less time to explain or appeal. Requests for payment plans were denied 3 times more often for younger individuals. Witnesses defending younger clients were frequently cut off mid-testimony. When Judge Elizabeth Warren was called in for multiple closed-session interviews, she appeared visibly shaken. Though she had been known for her sharp judicial demeanor, the evidence laid bare a truth she had never considered. "I always prided myself on fairness," she admitted quietly. "I didn't realize how much of my background and bias shaped how I judged others." For the first time, her rigid definition of fairness began to crack. But Warren wasn't the only one. The investigation, originally focused on her courtroom alone, revealed systemic issues across the region. Several judges in nearby districts showed similar patterns: unconscious biases, disproportionate penalties, inconsistent enforcement tied to age, class, and even perceived political affiliation. By the end of the 3rd week, Laura Bennett's team had finished compiling their findings. The final document was over 300 pages long, dense with statistics, transcripts, and testimonial analysis. As she laid it before the committee board, she made it clear: this isn't about isolated lapses. This is about a culture of quiet inequity that has operated unchecked for years. And it's not always malicious. Sometimes it's just never been questioned. And then came the shift. 3 months after Senator Cruz's confrontation with Judge Warren, the entire face of justice in New Hampshire began to change. At dawn, sunlight poured through the tall windows of the main courthouse in Concord, illuminating a brand new sign above the entrance: Center for Judicial Training and Fairness. Judge Elizabeth Warren no longer sat behind the bench. After the findings were released, she was given a choice: resign quietly or face a public disciplinary hearing. She chose a resignation, but in an unexpected turn, she didn't disappear. She became a speaker at the first mandatory judicial reform seminar. Standing at the podium, the once imposing judge was now a different woman. Her robe was gone, her tone was softer, her eyes more reflective. "I thought fairness meant treating everyone the same," she told the assembled judges, "but I never once examined how my assumptions treated people differently before they ever opened their mouths." In the back row sat Senator Ted Cruz, quietly observing. He hadn't expected this ending when he stood up in that courtroom. Just principle, not transformation. Beside him sat Margaret Evans, now promoted to lead the state's new court monitoring division, tasked with reviewing judicial conduct and public complaints. The reforms didn't stop there. Monthly audits of fines, dismissals, and contempt charges were now required. An independent panel of legal scholars, citizens, and advocates reviewed judicial behavior. Bailiff Robert Hayes was appointed to lead a new training program for all courtroom staff. "We're the eyes and ears," he told his first group of trainees. "It's our duty to speak when something feels wrong." The days of silence? They're over. Back in Washington, Senator Cruz looked up at the wall of his Senate office. Framed neatly behind his desk was the $500 fine receipt, now faded slightly from the sun. It had become a symbol, not of defeat, but of what happens when you stand your ground. Below the frame, a newer photo had been added, a group of young law students visiting his office after the hearing, inspired by the moment that turned a courtroom into a classroom for justice. The framed $500 fine receipt now hung behind Senator Ted Cruz's desk, not as a token of defeat, but as a symbol of change. Visitors often asked about it. Staffers told the story with pride. Beneath the frame was a new photograph, Cruz standing with a group of law students from across the country, young minds he now mentored through a weekly seminar on legal ethics and judicial bias. Reform had spread well beyond Concord. The New Hampshire Bar Association implemented a bias incident reporting system. In its first month, over 200 submissions flooded in. Each case was investigated. Many confirmed what Cruz had made visible, a culture of uneven justice long ignored. "This was never just about punishing wrongdoing," Cruz explained to a reporter during an interview. "It's about changing how we think about justice. Every person, regardless of age, gender, background, deserves dignity the moment they walk into a courtroom." His words echoed far beyond state lines. Other cities across New Hampshire adopted similar measures. Mandatory bias awareness, was training for courtroom staff, regular audits of judicial decisions for patterns of inequality, community oversight committees to ensure transparency, standardized fine guidelines to avoid discretion-driven disparities. And even law schools began mandating diversity and fairness training for future judges and lawyers. 3 months after the courtroom confrontation, a letter arrived at Cruz's Senate office. It was handwritten, simple, direct, from the young law student who had witnessed it all. "That moment changed my path. I now focus entirely on social justice law. You showed me that change is possible. Sometimes it just takes one person willing to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.'" She'd gone on to found a legal aid clinic at her law school to help defendants facing courtroom discrimination. Even the elderly local man who had been in the courtroom that day returned to the building. He walked slowly through the newly renovated courthouse halls. Multilingual welcome signs lined the entry. A staffed help desk offered free legal guidance. Security personnel now greeted every visitor with dignity. "I've been coming here for 40 years, he told a young clerk, voice trembling. "But this is the first time I've ever felt that justice might truly be fair." That same morning, Cruz's phone buzzed. A message from the Federal Judicial Review Board. They wanted him to chair a national commission on courtroom reform. He sat silently, recalling that morning 3 months ago in Elizabeth Warren's courtroom. One small decision, to challenge what others accepted, had triggered a chain of events still unfolding, still growing. In the courthouse's newly renovated main lobby, just beyond the security checkpoint, a brass plaque had been installed. On it, a quote, "Justice isn't just about the law, it's about how we treat each person who walks through these doors." Inscribed below, the day Senator Ted Cruz stood before Judge Elizabeth Warren and changed everything. The story of Senator Ted Cruz facing off against a sitting judge isn't just fiction, it's a mirror to real-world challenges. Bias in courtrooms, ageism, elitism, silence in the face of power. This tale reminds us, you don't need permission to challenge injustice, just preparation, courage, and clarity. Whether you're a law student, clerk, citizen, or senator, your voice matters. Don't let bias define you. Use your skills to reshape the system. One small stand can trigger a movement. Subscribe now to catch more powerful stories like this one. And remember, justice begins with one voice, maybe yours.